Due to the massive amount of demand, I finally decided to talk about treadmills. For most people, the electric treadmill has been a staple of health and fitness for as long as they can remember. But this hasn't always been the case. In fact, the first modern electric treadmill was only patented in 1952. Prior to that, they were actually made organically. Here, actually, let's just start from the beginning. The very beginning. While they are mostly known as domesticated creatures now, tanks used to actually be found in the wild. Prior to human domestication, they could be found throughout the plains of North America, Africa, parts of Europe, and around the middle of Asia. Much like elephants, they had very thick skin, and that made them extremely difficult to hunt down. And even if you did, it's not like it would taste very good, since their diet mostly consisted of iron. One thing you can do, though, is actually separate the soft part of the body from the rest. That part being the treads. It's not quite known exactly when the first treadmill was made, but it was a largely upscale and expensive product due to the rarity of wild tanks themselves. That was until 1911, when Claude Lorraine Hagen invented a way to domesticate and mass-produce the tanks a lot easier. This was later patented in 1913. This later led to the name treadmill. Tanks were often raised on farms with mills on them. So, when treads were harvested and treadmills were made, people buying them would say, "I'm off to go get a tread at the mill," which later shortened to the name treadmill, which we now use. Back on track though. This new method allowed for a boom in production, but also a boom in the tank population right before World War I. World War I is when the world first realized the usefulness in the domestication and training of tanks. Prior to this, horses were the main mode of transportation due to the speed they allowed for, but speed isn't exactly needed during trench warfare. Instead, you need power, which tanks have plenty of. Just for context, so you understand, horses have a power of 1 horsepower. This led to the selective breeding of tanks across every side of the war, and is the main reason we have so many different types of tanks today. Just like dog breeds, we also have tank breeds. While this did wonders for the tank population, it did hurt the production of treadmills tremendously, because all tanks were taken away from the farms that raised them and taken directly to the front lines. This and World War II are still to this day some of the lowest points in treadmill production and sales ever since mass production started in 1911. The end of the war ended up bringing American exceptionalism with it. This was constantly promoting the idea that Americans are stronger and smarter than the entire rest of the world. That thought process ended up leading to a large interest in fitness equipment leading into the Roaring Twenties. Specifically, the treadmill. Fun fact of the day. The Roaring Twenties was actually named after 2 completely different things happening in the cultural zeitgeist at that time. The first one being all the love, affection, and partying that was going on. And the second one being all the massive advances in paleontology at the time. So there was a lot of love being shared and a lot of dinosaurs that people were interested in. And so they just combined the two and named it the Roaring Twenties due to the fact that "rar" actually means "I love you" in dinosaur. Therefore, the official name is actually the "I love you 20s." But everyone calls it the Roaring Twenties. As anyone in a technology field would tell you, large growth without preparation comes with lots of problems. Treadmills were no exception. Organic treadmills were made by taking the treads off of tanks and attaching them to spokes, similar to how a wheel operates. They were powered purely by the person using them, so as you walked forward, the treads were supposed to turn instead in order to keep you in place. Obviously, there's problems here. If there's any resistance at all from the tread or the spokes, you would just walk forward instead of staying on the treadmill. This led to a corresponding increase in oil sales, as people bought the oil in order to keep the spokes lubricated while using it. At the end of 1928, there was a major marketing campaign that advertised treadmills and working out as a wonderful New Year's resolution and something to buy in order to work on yourself in 1929. It was a massive success. Not only is it still, to date, the largest single increase in treadmill sales in history, but it also came with a large increase in oil sales with it. Of course, though, as most of you know, New Year's resolutions never last. By October of 1929, most people had stopped working out entirely. What followed was a massive plummet in oil prices, then stock prices, then a run on the bank, and finally, the Great Depression. Nobody really bought a treadmill during the Great Depression, so it seems like depression and working out don't really go together. And then, the best thing that could have happened did happen. World War II. It brought back interest in breeding tanks, but also keeping fit and healthy in order to flex on our enemies. What followed was of course the Cold War, but more importantly to treadmills, activism in the United States. Specifically, animal rights activism. In 1952, the first ever electric treadmill was invented by Robert Bruce and Wayne Quinton at the University of Washington, and required no tanks to die. The production of this led many to realize that the old method of harvesting tanks was inhumane and entirely unnecessary. It turns out that if you cut the legs off of something and just kind of leave it there, it doesn't like that very much. After about a month and a half of mild protesting, the US finally banned the use of tank treads on July 2nd, 1954. On that same day, 10 years later, the Civil Rights Act would be passed. And that pretty much leads to where we are now. Of course, there are minor talking points such as the 80s workout video craze, but ultimately it just leads to nicer rubber and a touchscreen. If you enjoyed learning with me today, make sure to like and share the video so others can learn too. And don't forget to subscribe, then you can have more lessons in the future.